And welcome everyone to this episode of Econ Talk Kickstart 2023 here on CGTN. I'm Michael Wong in Beijing. Well, China has said that it will prioritize the expansion of domestic demand this year and boost consumption. Indeed, many of the world's top financial institutions forecast a consumption and services-led growth path for this year for China. So, what can we expect from the world's second largest consumer market in 2023? And what more can China do to leverage the rising prosperity of its consumers to power growth going forward? Well, let's talk more about this and bring in Bruno Lan, senior partner at Bain & Company. Bruno specializes in consumer products, luxury, and retail. We also have Dr. David Blair, who is vice president and senior economist at the think tank Center for China and Globalization. And we also have Chen Jiahe, chief investment officer at Novum RK Technologies. Thank you all so much for joining us on today's Econ Talk Kickstart 2023. Bruno, I want to start with you. When we take a look at mobility here in China, when it comes to the roads, when it comes to the highways, the trains, the planes, mobility is back. Let's talk about the consumption recovery. How strong is the consumption recovery you're seeing right now? Maybe give us a picture of where you're based. You're based in Shanghai right now, so how is Shanghai shaping up in terms of the consumption recovery, and also what you're seeing across the country by talking to your clients?
Yes, Michael, thank you very much for having me here on this forum. Consumption is back for sure. I mean, that's the great news of January and Chinese New Year. The government has published some numbers for Chinese New Year which were very positive, including some sectors that have grown very well versus last year. Some sectors that have even grown ahead of 2019, which was, I think, very remarkable. And of course, we see a lot of those sectors that have been penalized by the lockdowns and the COVID policies last year, like restaurants and food service, have been doing extremely well. So overall, I think it's a very good start. Of course, it has been fueled by Chinese New Year, and there is some excitement always about Chinese New Year. So people have spent for Chinese New Year, of course, and they were happy to meet their families for the first time in 3 years. Yeah. And so all of this has been fueling the growth, of course, but at the same time, I think there are some work to be done, and I think we're going to talk about that more to resume the confidence of Chinese consumers longer term, I think.
Yeah, that's going to be key in terms of really restoring that confidence, making sure the expectation is there for businesses to invest and for consumers to spend as well. Let me head to Southwest China, a few thousand kilometers away from where I am right now, and get to you, David. You are currently in Southwest China's Yunnan province. So maybe give us an update in terms of how you're seeing consumption recover in Yunnan province, and also how you see China's consumption recovery playing out throughout the year. So last year, we had many financial institutions talking about perhaps a bumpy recovery for the Chinese economy this year. But at least here in Beijing, we've seen quite a sharp bounce back when it comes to consumption and mobility. What are you seeing in Yunnan, and how do you see consumption playing out for the rest of 2023?
I think in Yunnan, you need to look at different areas, of course. I live in Yuqi, which is a small city about 1 hour south of Kunming, about 100 kilometers, and has maybe 400,000 people. I'm seeing a lot of pickup of activity, people shopping downtown, going to restaurants. Has a very active sort of downtown with a lot of young people. Whether they're buying something, I don't know, but they're at least going around the streets and looking at stuff. But at the same time, a lot of restaurants during the COVID crisis were closed, and I haven't seen many of them reopen. So there may be quite a few small businesses in particular, which are having a hard time recovering from 2 or 3 years with low or no income. So I think an important task that the government has been facing and is dealing with is encouraging businesses to recover and people to recover their businesses. There's a lot of building activity here, many apartment buildings going up. Most of them are pre-sold, so that tells me there's enough demand for apartments. Although I wonder whether that will continue. There seem to be so many, I'm not sure whether the construction boom can continue. This is a city with lots of small businesses, lots of little small shops, but most of them are either food shops or either restaurant related things, or they're somehow related to construction or home furnishing or something to do with new apartments. So it seems like that the key is allowing people to continue to buy and build new apartments, but that won't continue forever. So I think China will be looking for new growth engines going into the future.
Yeah.
Essentially, you had two growth engines over the last 20 years. You had exports during the 2010s, and then another big growth engine was construction, both of apartments and office buildings and of infrastructure. Both of those are sort of filled out. And so we're looking for new growth engines. I think that's the key task for China over the next few years.
Yeah.
In Kunming, on the other hand, I see a lot of luxury products being sold, a lot of very high-end malls being built. Sort of, there seems to be a huge demand for luxury products, many of them imported luxury products.
And Kunming, by the way, for our audience, that is the provincial capital of Yunnan province.
Yes, it is.
Yes. I think something that Yunnan can focus on definitely is tourism as a future growth driver, because you have absolutely stunning scenery in Yunnan province, and perhaps we can talk about that a little bit more in terms of tourism.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, this Chinese New Year, there was a huge tourism boom. It was very hard my wife wanted to go back to Beijing, very hard to get an air ticket or a train ticket for several days. Prices had gone way up. So that tells me there's a big demand for tourism to a warm place during this Chinese New Year.
Yeah. I mean, what is the temperature right now where you are in Yunnan province? I mean, it's still winter, it's February here in the Northern Hemisphere, but just to give our audience a sense.
It's maybe 25 or so.
Wow, 25. I think that is perfect temperature. I'd love to talk more about tourism in Yunnan, but you wanted to say something, David?
No.
Okay.
I just think the key going forward is to look for new growth engines. As the Chinese government has said, the Chinese market has to move upscale, has to move into producing more sophisticated products. I think a great emphasis is on getting people in the countryside and in the small cities enough income so they can consume a lot.
Yeah.
That's really the big growth engine going forward.
We're definitely going to talk about that, David, because we still have about 500 million people in the countryside. And if we see their incomes rising to a certain level, that's going to also help boost consumption in the country as well. But Jiahe, I want to come to you in terms of how you see consumption playing out throughout the rest of the year, because we do see that strong consumption bounce back in January and February, and I'm wondering how sustainable it is, because policymakers have said that this is a priority for this year, right? It's about expanding domestic demand, it's about boosting consumption for this year, but also beyond. But for the rest of this year, how do you see consumption playing out?
Yeah, we have seen the consumption be rebounding quite quickly during the Chinese festival, as David has mentioned. And currently, we can see that the consumption is gradually picking back in different industries. For example, when we look at the Chinese New Year, which is only 1 or 2 months right after the changing of the COVID policy, we have seen the rebounding of the tourism industry has been really quick. But some other industries, for example, book consumption, has not been rebounding that quickly. It takes a bit more time, like 3 or 4 months, to recover to its Euro standard. And also, if you look at consumption of many other items, such as mobile phone, computers and laptops, they are much slower compared with tourism, because tourism industry is the first one that actually comes out, as well as restaurants, because people have been locking down in their homes for quite a long period of time. And when all the policies are removed, they say, okay, we want to travel in the first 10. But when do they say that I want to change my mobile phone, I want to change my laptop, these kind of consumptions, I want to buy a new car, is that when they are more confident about their income, they're more confident about their income, more confident about their investment, more confident about their businesses, instead to say, okay, I'm going to have enough cash flow in the future, so let me consume some more. So that really takes a period of time for the consumption confidence to come back. It has been recognized that it probably takes like at least 3 months or maybe 6 months for the overall consumption to come back to its original level. So that's a period of time to take. That's why the government is also trying to set out the policy throughout the year to stimulate the consumption. Because when you look at the Chinese economy right now in this year, consumption is probably the most important sector to bring the economy back to its usual track, because export is something that we can't really expect too much this year, because we have seen the global economy is quite fragile at this moment. It's not that strong. So the export is not something that we can really count on. We want the export to be strong, but that's not something that China can decide alone. If the demand from Europe and America start to slow or at least smooth, then that means the export would still face some pressure. And when we look at the investment, that's another story, because the investment has been taking up too much tasks in the past 3 years to save the economy. So it's a lot of investment has been done. I mean, a lot of projects, construction work, highway, airports, these kind of constructions have already been started in the past 3 years. We can't keep on adding too much investment projects. So when you look at all these sectors, the consumption would be the one that really saves the economy this year. So, and it takes like 3 to 6 months for it to recover to its euro standard. So that's why the government is taking all the measures to stimulate the consumption.
Okay, so Jiahe, how would you characterize perhaps the strength of the signal, the tone from the government in terms of supporting consumption? Because we see the signals from the central government, but also local governments across China also unveiling their own detailed plans to boost consumption. And do you think these pro-consumption policies will continue throughout the rest of the year? So right now we see, for example, consumption vouchers for targeted industries and targeted products. We see perhaps even free tickets to tourism destinations. And we see this pickup in consumer loans as well. Will these pro-consumption policies continue throughout the rest of the year?
I think so. I mean, at least for the first 6 to 9 months, if the consumption really goes back to its normal level in September or August, then maybe the policies will withdraw. I mean, those policies, as you mentioned, like giving out coupons, cutting taxes, rising income, providing jobs, all these kind of things are being used to stimulate the consumption from the central government to the local governments, because there are so many detailed works to do. I mean, if you look at China, China is so huge. I mean, it goes like thousands of kilometers from the north to the south. So every province, every city really has a different kind of consumption economy over there. So for every city, the consumption policies would be quite different. So that's why we see the central government is setting out an overall policy, and the local governments, each local government of each city is setting out the particular policy based on its own circumstances. So I mean, these policies would definitely continue into the summer, and whether it will continue throughout the year really depends on how it works out. If everything works out pretty fine by the summer or the autumn, then maybe the policies will withdraw. But otherwise, we will see the policies throughout the year.
Well, Deutsche Bank was talking about a 20 trillion RMB of buildup in savings in the past 3 years. So when the Chinese consumer does come back and comes back even stronger, it has quite a massive buildup of savings to draw on. Let's talk about the future a little bit in terms of how to unleash consumption potential even better. Bruno, I want to come to you because recently we saw China's finance minister, Mr. Liu Kun, writing an article, and he was talking about in terms of how to boost consumption down the road. It's about making Chinese consumers more willing to consume and making Chinese consumers perhaps creating a more convenient environment as well for consumers to spend. What do you make of these comments?
The main barriers to consumption last year were two. There were two barriers essentially. One was, of course, the COVID and the lockdowns. We know that, and now this has been fixed. But the other one was really the real estate, and the real estate, of course, is a critical sector in China. It's the saving accounts for the households, as we know. It's also a big source of income for the local authorities. And so when the sector is sort of suffering and not delivering the growth that is expected, then of course that has a big impact on the economy. And that has a big impact on the consumer confidence. So, the first driver, the COVID has been solved. The second one is being solved, but it's going to take a longer time to see the full effect. So my belief, I think I agree that all those incentives will help, but I think the real question is rebuilding consumer confidence so that they can actually spend normally and they don't need the artificial subsidies and programs that have been put in place. I think these programs can help, but they are not really solving the ultimate confidence problem. So I think it's going to take time. I agree to solve this confidence problem. I think a major driver of that confidence will be the real estate and how, households will be confident that, first of all, they can get the apartment that they bought, that the deleveraging of the developers is happening, and there is more confidence into the real estate sector. Then I think that will drive in turn confidence in buying larger ticket items like the one that have been mentioned, like a car, a nice smartphone, etc. And that's going to have a very positive impact on the overall consumption. So yes, I think these incentives are important. Convenience, of course, is important, as was mentioned, but also solving that sort of structural problem that has been there before COVID. Actually, it started in 2021 with all of those leveraged developers that created some problems, and so that's what needs to be fixed, and it's a bigger problem. So I'm very optimistic. I think we have said in the past, and you have probably read some of our reports, that the next China is China. So when we were the first one to say this back in, I think it was April 22. So even at the time when China was not at the best of its form, by far compared to today, we were still very optimistic. In part because I think the number of middle class households that are going to be created over the next 7 to 10 years is going to be the same as the number of middle-class households that have been created in the previous 10 years. And so that's why we are doubling the number of households at middle-income level. And that's absolutely fantastic to drive consumption. And so we believe the next China is China, but it will take a while, and in particular solving that real estate bubble that, to really be unleashed.
Okay. Two follow-up questions for you, Bruno. First of all, so Bain was the first company you're saying to say the next China is China because recently another firm, a competitor firm, I'm not going to name who, has come out with a similar statement. But you're saying Bain was the first one to make that statement, right? Because right now you have some people saying, oh, maybe China has peaked in terms of growth. Maybe it's going to be a different economy for China going forward. But you're saying, and Bain was saying,
Michael, I will send you the article, April 2022.
April 2022, Bain said that.
April 2022 said the next China is China.
Yeah.
We have also said multiple times the China is the best consumer story in the world.
Yeah.
Because it has the potential growth and it has the size.
Exactly.
And so the combination of both, I think, is just extraordinary. So we, and we also say, by the way, that the China growth story has never been a straight line.
Yeah.
There has been some accidents along the way, sometimes driven by outside, like the financial crisis, sometimes driven by inside, like what happened last year. But it's never a straight line. But the direction of travel is absolutely clear.
Yeah.
We are very, very optimistic that with our clients and within Bain about the potential of China consumption and the China market.
Yeah. And your overseas clients with operations in China, Bruno, they understand that structural factor in terms of boosting consumption down the road as well, right? You mentioned the middle income population because China aims to double that by 2035 from now over 400 million to 800 million plus in terms of middle income population. And like you mentioned, you add onto that a supersized market that's becoming more and more unified, a better business environment. I mean, that should definitely provide a lot of opportunities. There's scale and depth in China's consumer market. And Bain's clients, you would say, understand the structural forces pushing China's consumption market forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think many of those companies have been, especially multinationals, they have been around, of course, for many years. And so they have lived through some of those hiccups that I mentioned earlier. So sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up. There's some evolution, but they have a very clear North Star, which is, this market. I've also used the expression many times, this should be your second home market. So, so it should be as big or even bigger than your home market, depending on the size of your home market, of course. And so I think many companies believe that this is the real potential of China. But again, it's not a straight line. There will be accidents along the way, but let's keep the steady faith and commitment to the growth of the market is what matters.
Yeah. Oh, Volkswagen, for example, second home market. I think they said China is their second home market. David, I want to come to you because one other key factor that's going to boost consumption, not only here in China, but for any economy, it's about raising average disposable incomes and raising incomes in general. What more do you think China needs to do to raise the average disposable incomes, especially for the low and middle income population? Because these two groups have a stronger and bigger marginal propensity to consume down the road. What more do you think China needs to do? David?
I want to reinforce that point, that it's really not consumption that matters in the long term, it's incomes that matter in the long term. And we can talk about consumption incentives for the year or so, but what really matters is the next 10 years or the next 20 years. And China its consumption has grown so much over the last 20 years because average real incomes, median real incomes, have been growing so rapidly. Most years during the last 20 years, they were growing faster than GDP growth, which was already high. So that explains the consumption story over the last 20 years. I think it's important that China continues to raise median real incomes. That's median means 50% above and 50% below. So if you have I don't think it's a good story if you have an economy driven purely by high-income people. I mean, you do see a lot of high-income people buying very expensive cars and very expensive purses and things like that. But I saw more of that 7 or 8 years ago in China than I see now. I see more emphasis on buying ordinary consumption goods. So where are those median real incomes going to be created? One is by moving companies up market. As incomes go up, as wages go up, the company has to find more productive uses for those more costly employees, and they can produce not the cheap stuff they used to produce in 2005 or so, but they have to aim for producing higher value stuff. That's one part of it. The place where I think China has a huge opportunity is, as you mentioned, the 500 million people still out in the countryside. They may not be as poor as you think. Often they live. Now they certainly have, for a long time, they've had enough to eat. They usually own a car. They often live in very nice houses, which they either pay nothing for or they pay very little for. So they have more consumable income than you might think. So I think targeting them and the kinds of things they want to buy is very important. I also think China needs to, and I know the government's working on this, but there needs to be a strong effort to improve the education services and healthcare services for small towns and the countryside, because those people have a lot of potential. They're really the future of the country. And that's sort of low-hanging fruit for increasing incomes. The next, invest some more so that a child in a rural village doesn't feel that he's so disadvantaged from the most educated area of Beijing or Shanghai. I know that's a big call, but there might be an educational business opportunity either for AI or telecommunications to really boost the education that people are getting in country schools, and therefore increase their productivity in the future. So those are the two ways that I think China is growing in the future. It's important. We're talking about the short term mainly, and the short term transition from COVID is a very unusual situation. But China is also going through a structural economic transition from being a low wage, investment led economy to a much higher wage, much more sort of consumer-led and much more sort of high services-led economy than it has in the past.
So David, when I speak to a lot of the young people here in China, they actually want to perhaps go to the countryside, perhaps go to smaller cities and avoid the hustle and bustle of really large urban centers here in Beijing. It's a different lifestyle, it's a different pace.
Yep.
And when you talk about education, do you think that will really help? Because the hard infrastructure, I think, is there. So I always like to raise the example of one of my business trips to Guizhou province, where it's a very hilly province. And I was just amazed by the infrastructure there in terms of the high-speed rail going through tunnels, going across valleys. So the hard infrastructure is in the countryside. When you pick up the education there as well, do you think young people will want to stay more in perhaps rural areas and smaller cities?
Well, China, I think, probably has the best infrastructure in the world. Now, as you mentioned, you have high-speed rail. One time I took the high-speed rail from Kunming to Beijing, thinking I'd see a lot of beautiful views of the countryside in southern China. And I was in a tunnel most of the way. So that's a very expensive train. But it's there, and it really improves connectivity. You can't say that, I mean, I don't know all of China, but I think most of it very well connected, not only with transportation, but also communications. You have 5G and 4G almost everywhere. And that's not true in the United States, for example. There are a lot of rural areas that don't get good communications. I've heard a lot of people say that they feel they have to move to the big cities, although they don't enjoy the lifestyle. And the big cities are very sort of, well, they're just expensive and time consuming. And they would prefer to stay in their town, but they often move for their children's education. And so I think making sure that that the parents feel that their young children can get the equivalent education or near equivalent in the countryside would be a big step forward to spreading prosperity around the country, and also keeping sort of the smarter or the more entrepreneurial people, keeping them in their hometown and letting them build a business there. That's really the key to growth.
Okay. David, one more question to you before I turn it over to Jiahe, because you're from the United States, and we've seen real wages in the United States pretty much stagnate, I would say, in the past at least 20, perhaps even 30 years. What lessons do you think China can draw from some of the more advanced and developed economies in the world where we have seen real wages stagnate? I mean, here in China, real wages have held up quite well in the past few years because inflation has been kept in check. But in terms of structurally long term, what do you think are some of the lessons for China?
It's worse than the last 20 years, and it's worse than stagnating. Since 1979, there has been zero increase in median real wages in the United States. And the last couple of years, they've been going down sharply because wages have been increasing much less than the rate of inflation. So people are becoming worse off. The puzzle is, I mean, what was happening is you were having a big transfer of wealth from labor to capital. The amount of GDP going to laborers fell by about 10 percentage points of GDP during the last 40 years. I think that was due to policy decisions. I mean, I have a whole theory of that we can't go on into here, but the U.S. economy has become much more monopolized. The political system has become much more corrupt. We've seen a change in the banking system, which used to emphasize essentially there were tens of thousands of local banks whose job was to loan to local small businesses. Most of them have gone out of business because of changing regulation, and they've been replaced by sort of 10 big Wall Street banks, which make most of their income by fees rather than loans to small businesses. So they're simply not interested in making loans to small businesses. So sort of the infrastructure supporting the businesses has gone away. And these were, I think, terrible policy decisions made over the last 30 years. I'd advise China to look at that history and don't do it. That's my main recommendation. But I think China's emphasis on encouraging competition is important. I think there are some issues that need to be resolved as how between the private sector and the SOEs, for example, will have to be resolved in the next few years to further encourage people to build wealth. And I'm not talking about building great wealth. I'm talking about people building enough to own a home and to send their children to a good school and take care of themselves in their old age. Yeah. That will encourage them to consume more.
Yeah, for sure. Jiahao, I want to come to you because David was talking about perhaps big wealth transfers that he's seen in the United States, and China doesn't want to see that, right? That's why China has proposed something called the Common Prosperity Initiative. It's not a new concept. This has been around for quite a long time, but we are seeing a stronger emphasis on common prosperity going forward. Explain to our audience how you see the connection between common prosperity and boosting consumption down the road, right? So common prosperity, at least to me, a big part is about increasing the size of the middle income population, have that olive structure when it comes to income distributions. What do you think?
Yeah, that's quite right. I mean, if we look at all the government policies in countries like China, United States, Singapore, where in Singapore it has been strongly emphasized these kind of common prosperity, where they have been trying to do that. So it is really important that you have a large middle income rather than a very small group of rich people and a lot of people without much money, because when we compare these two situations, one is that you have a large middle income. The second is you have a small group of wealthy people. Even if they spend the same amount of money every year, even this is the case, but for the whole economy, it will be much better to have a lot of people to spend, because in that case, when you have a lot of middle income people to spend, they will spend money on something that is really useful for your life. You know, not something with luxury brand, not something with fancy features, but not really useful in the real life. But they will spend money with things like a mobile phone, cars, houses, furniture, all these kind of things. And these kind of things really boost the economy by many extent. Because, you know, mobile phone factory employs a lot of people, furniture factory employs a lot of people, these kind of things. But if you have a small group of people with a lot of money to spend, they will buy things like luxury bags, these kind of jewelries. These kind of things are really not that good for the economy. If you look at when we talk about the wealth of the nation, so that is why we have to have so-called common prosperity, or whatever the name you name it, which means give the massive amount of people a lot of money to spend, so that the consumption of the economy will be really strong rather than just being strong on the numbers.
Yeah. I mean, luxury definitely has its targeted population segment as well, because Bruno specializes in luxury, and I want to ask Bruno in just a second about the luxury market. But Jiahao, I want to stay with you for another question. In terms of different industries we see, for example, green products are picking up pace these days, health and wellness. You see all these new areas and industries where consumption is picking up. But in terms of geography, I was taking a look at some of the foreign direct investment numbers, and we're seeing more FDI coming into China's central and western regions. What do you think about these two areas? The west of China, the central parts of China, because often we think about the large cities along the eastern seaboard from the north to the south. But how big of a potential, how many opportunities are there, do you think, in the western and central parts of China to really boost consumption even more in this country?
Well, that is when you talk about the growth potential. It really comes from the places where the income is less compared with, when you have, currently the per capita GDP of China is about $13,000. And when you look at eastern cities like Shanghai, Nanjing, and Beijing, these cities are having like $20,000 or $25,000 per capita GDP. So that means their growth potential has been much slower compared with the central and the western regions. So when you see all these investments come in, they would pick the places that are, potentially having more potential to grow, and much less cost when you think about the cost of land, cost of labor, cost of logistics, these kind of things. So that is why China has been putting a large emphasis in these years on its countryside, because currently we have about 35% of the people still living in the countryside and 65% in the urban areas. And when you look at the per capita income, the countryside people are having about 40 to 50. I think it's about 40% of the income of the urban people. So that means they have a large potential for them to grow. And when they have more money, they will be able to spend. So that is why we are putting the emphasis on these less developed regions.
One more question for you, Jiahe, because you're in the finance industry, and we've seen a major move by China's securities regulator recently in terms of capital market reform. China has now gone to this IPO registration system, where the securities regulator does not have to approve every single company that wants to go public. You register, if you meet the qualifications, you can list. How big of a boost do you think that will be for the private sector, especially for small and medium-sized companies that need more financing needs?
Well, this action is actually aiming at increasing the efficiency of China's capital market. I mean, its allocation of bonds, these kind of things. Because in the past, China has adopted so-called the approval system. That is, one company, when it wants to raise funds from the market, it has to first get an approval paper. And as long as it got the approval from the authorities, then it really doesn't have to worry too much about how the investors are valuing the company. And for the main board, it's very interesting that in the past few years, the IPO PE ratio, the valuation ratio, has been set at 22 times for almost all the companies going to the main board. So they really don't have to worry about investors. I mean, as long as you get the approval paper, you sell your IPO price at 22 times PE ratio. And that's not increasing efficiency, which is what this reform is really aiming at. So with this reform in the future is that the government or authority approval is no longer important. What's important is the recognition from investors, so that the companies with more efficiency, more profitability, more potential to grow will be much easier to get their fund compared with the past. But on the other hand, because there is no more approval needed, so you will see a lot of companies coming in to say that, okay, we want to go to IPO. And many of them would be mediocre companies. And for these companies, it will be hard for them to get the money. So actually, the overall money provided by investors will be approximately the same for the market. This reform is not aiming at increasing the total amount of money available in the market, but it is actually aiming at increasing the efficiency of allocating these bonds.
But it would, I would assume, give small and medium-sized enterprises more options to list, right? Especially innovation-driven ones, because we see new boards, for example, in Beijing, for example, in Shanghai. At least there are 2 new channels for SMEs to list and to raise funding if they need it. But I guess what you're saying, this is going to increase competition, Jiahe. This is about may the best firm win, right, when it comes to these small firms as well. And I would assume that has productivity implications also. And when you see total factor productivity perhaps increasing in an economy, that has implications for incomes, and that has implications for consumption as well. So I guess a whole chain effect.
Well, you talk about the whole macro picture, chain effect. Yeah, that's right. I mean, why we have this Chinese economy so prosperous right now compared with 45 years ago? Because we have the market economy, because we have encouraged people to compete against each other in a free market. You're efficient, you win out, and you're not efficient, you're not responsible to your own money, you lose. So this is the overall picture. I mean, how we have achieved this economic improvement in the past 4 decades is because we improved efficiency. So this is the reason why this reform is taken. By your explanation, yeah, I mean, from all these chain effect, and when you look at the macro picture, the efficiency will be better improved, and everything will be better. The GDP, the income, the unemployment rate, the consumption, everything.
Okay. I do want to turn to the luxury market now and get to Bruno. Bruno, so you've written that China's luxury market has seen a bit of a setback in 2022. China was the largest luxury consumer for many years in a row, but 2022 we saw a bit of a setback. But you also wrote that the luxury market here in China, luxury consumption, is poised for recovery in 2023. Maybe expand on that for us a little bit more in terms of what you're seeing.
Yes, I will, Michael. But if you don't mind, I'd like to come back just to the previous discussion for just a minute, because
absolutely.
I think that's the crux of our discussion tonight. I think it's so we say, to drive consumption, we need income per capita growth, and to get income per capita growth, we need job creation, and to get job creation, we absolutely need entrepreneurs who are successful and who can actually create those jobs and increase, the paycheck to their employees. So all of this is a continuum. And so what I was very pleased to read recently is that the China government said they have three priorities. One is growth, stability, and confidence. And I think these are three key words because they're all related. Entrepreneurs need confidence. They need a stable environment, a stable regulatory environment, a stable fiscal environment, a stable economic environment, so that they can actually create their enterprise and create jobs. Consumers, as we mentioned before, they also need that stable environment and to be their confidence. And so all of these are ingredients to growth. And I think we should really assume that the key driver of consumption ultimately is job creation through healthy enterprises. And so everything we can do, or the government can do, to incentivize entrepreneurs to continue to create jobs, to continue to create companies, I think is going to ultimately contribute a lot to consumption. The other thing I wanted to mention is I think on the one of the big transition and one of the big driver of income per capita growth is clearly to be able to manage that transition at a huge scale, of course, which is the scale of the China economy, between the blue collar workers to the service workers, because of course some of the industrial jobs are being eliminated, replaced by robots, and then there is a huge demand for service jobs, in the tech sector and the service sector. And so a key driver of income per capita growth is to manage that transition, and to do that, the imperative of reskilling, retraining those workers so that they can actually transition from their past job to the new jobs where there is demand and where there is higher income potential. That is a key challenge, I think companies and government should work on together. So just I think to on this overall question. Now going back to sorry. Yes,
hold on, Bruno. 1 second. Let me stop you 1 second, because you raised some very great points. I just want to make our audience aware we are seeing this massive push towards vocational education here in China as well. So in terms of reskilling, I think that definitely plays one role into it. It's not the whole picture, but I think it would help. You spoke about entrepreneurship, Bruno, and I want to just get your sense of what do you think about the entrepreneurial spirit here in China compared to the rest of the world? What have you seen so far? Just give our audience a broader sense of the entrepreneurial spirit you see in China.
I think, well, I've always said as well that China is a land of entrepreneurs. I think and I hope it continues. I think the last couple of years may have changed the mindset of entrepreneurs to some extent. I think but if you look at the last 40 years, I think the success of China, the job creation of China, has been driven, of course, by the government 5-year plan, etc., and the build out of infrastructure, which has been an amazing enabler for the entrepreneurs to do what they want to do, which is create jobs and create success stories with their companies. And so that has been, to me, the major driver of the Chinese economy in the past. The combination of the two, the 5-year plan and the entrepreneurial spirit, I think the combination of the two has been absolutely tremendously successful. Now, I think we need to continue to do that. Of course, there is a next normal, as we call it now. It's not the new normal; it's the next normal, coming back out of COVID. But yes, those two pillars, the 5-year plan and the build out of infrastructure, helping companies to do what they are supposed to do, and letting the entrepreneurs do what they want to do, that I think is a continuous recipe for success. And so hopefully we're going to see more of that in the next few years.
Got it. Okay. Back to luxury market, Bruno. You were talking about
Yes.
writing about the luxury market recovery.
Yeah, no, I think, well, it's a small market. Everybody is focused on this because it's, it's luxurious and it's fancy and it's exciting, but I call it a cottage industry. It's really a small industry, and so it's a bit artificial in many ways to just look at that compared to a lot of other sectors that are much more important. But to answer your question, yes, 2022 was a setback. I think that's driven by of course, the COVID situation, and the traffic in shopping malls in particular has been extremely impacted. We estimate 30 to 35% down last year. So of course, when people cannot go shopping, then they don't go, and that has an impact on luxury consumption. I think the recovery is simply part of this consumption growth. I think some of you mentioned the fact that people were rushing, of course, because of the New Year and of course the gifting tradition. So everybody was rushing back to buy some of those luxury products, which is good. But that's only one small part of, I think, the overall growth of consumption that we should see in the future.
Yeah. Well, China has been the largest luxury consumer for many years in a row. So from what I read, it's about 35 to maybe 40% of global luxury consumption. Do you think, is that a peak? Or can it get any higher than that?
I think it's going to go back there. It used to be there in 2019. And then, of course, there's been a bit of a reduction of the Chinese contribution to global consumption, of luxury consumption in the past couple of years. But yes, we believe that it should go back to that level of 35 to 40%. In fact, for some brands, some companies, it's already higher than that.
Yeah.
It depends, but that's a good average. That Chinese as a nationality should represent 35 to 40% of the luxury market. Yes.
Well, I haven't been yet, but if I have time, I want to check out this massive duty-free luxury shopping complex in Hainan province, Haikou, right? The duty-free shopping city, which is at a whopping 280,000 square meters. It's the largest standalone shopping facility, I think, in the world. And then you have one in Sanya as well at 120,000 square meters in terms of this duty-free shopping complex. So that would be cool to check out.
I think that's part of it. That's a very smart move, I should say. To repatriate. I think we have in some of our reports we have said that historically up to 2019, Chinese nationals were buying 65% of their luxury purchases outside China, including outside the mainland, including Hong Kong, Macau, but also mostly other countries. And 35% only in the mainland. And so a key strategy is, of course, for all the players, including the brands. Actually, it was a concerted effort by the brands and the Chinese government to say, no, we need to repatriate because it's much easier to manage when Chinese buy in China. And so there's been a big push. Of course, COVID has helped because last 2 years, 95% was bought locally. But so we believe that ultimately it's going to be the reverse, 65% in the mainland, 35% outside.
Bruno, real quick, because you're involved in retail, you're involved in consumer products. What do you think businesses need to do in this next normal that you mentioned to really succeed? Because I feel the environment is changing fast. China's consumer market moves at a very rapid pace. So in terms of really engaging the Chinese consumer, and really not just engage, but also to retain the Chinese consumer, what do businesses need to do, both domestic and multinationals operating in China?
I think it's a very similar playbook as before. I think it's all about satisfying your consumers, and so that has many implications in terms of first and foremost, I think the product offering and your innovation, because that's key. That's always the key. But second, and as important, is of course the way to engage and some of the digital platforms you engage with, and how you activate your brands and your products online and potentially offline as well. And then 3, of course, is your route to market and how you leverage either the platforms online or the retail footprint and the distributors to really promote your products locally. And so I think this has not changed. The pace, we talk about China's speed. I think the pace at which you need to do that, of course, is always there. And so that's also one of the features that we expect is going to come back. I think competition under China's speed is going to resume very, very quickly.
Got it. David, I want to come to you and ask you about the relationship between innovation and consumption here in China, because China now is the world's largest patent filer, and you've written before that innovation needs to be spread out. Are you perhaps seeing that here in China, and how do you see the relationship between China's rising innovation power as well as future consumption?
I think we still see several big innovation hubs. I think in particularly Guangdong province is in a unusual position that they're a high-tech plus manufacturing innovation hub. So that gives them a great position in the world. I'm hoping they'll spread some of that capability. I think they are to inland places. You see a few inland places like Chengdu in particular has a lot of high-tech capability and is building up that. I think it's building up that very rapidly. Some other big inland cities, I don't see so much innovation. I think we need to be careful when we talk about innovation. We think we're talking about often sort of high-tech, AI, very high scientifically related stuff. Well, that's one kind of innovation. That's one kind of business. The other is a more traditional type of usually small family business, which innovates in the sense that it increases productivity. The German term for entrepreneur is Unternehmer, which means the undersigned person. That I'm a person that takes responsibility for this company. It's my company. It's my family's company. And you see people building up a business of maybe 10, 20, 100 people, and that employs a lot of people. That's innovation too. And I think those kinds of entrepreneurs, you're going to see a lot of that in the countryside because people are trying to build up. They build up, in a village. There'll be one guy that starts a business, a construction business or a trucking business or a glass making business or something like that. And he employs a lot of family members, other people in the village. They build lots of houses. They buy lots of cars. I had the good luck a few years ago to go to a village in southern Hebei province. Hebei is the province, much poorer province surrounding Beijing. And that village produced fishing rods, and they mostly sold them online. The selling online was the key. They had both the physical infrastructure, the roads and the railroads, and the 4G to sell the fishing rods. But you had lots of small businesses in that town that were employing, each of them employed, between 10 and 20 people. And you wouldn't think you could become rich selling fishing rods. But the whole village had become quite wealthy based on that. They told me that 10 years before I visited the place, there were no cars in the village. There was no place to park all the Mercedes-Benz and BMWs in the village now. So that's a kind of innovation, which I think China is really the sort of the family-oriented innovation is just as important as sort of the AI innovation that we're seeing in Beijing. And I think it's important that the government encourages both kinds. The smaller kind of business I'm talking about is really up to the local governments, and it's important that the spirit of dynamism, spirit of entrepreneurship is understood by the local governments as well as by the central government in Beijing.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And part of China's strategy to really revitalize its massive countryside and rural areas is really building up local industries in the countryside as well. So I was reading a report, gentlemen, by JP Morgan that said the Chinese consumer is the second biggest contributor to global consumption growth. So that number for the year 2021 came in at 23%. So the Chinese consumer contributed to 23% of global consumption growth. Number one, unsurprisingly, of course, is the United States, so at around 33%. What did surprise me was Europe. I mean, European consumers contributed just 9% to global consumption growth, and then the rest of the world combined is at around 35%. So I'm going to make a prediction here and say that because there's still a long way to go in terms of China unleashing its full consumption potential, that eventually the Chinese consumer will be the world's largest contributor to global consumption growth. And I was wondering if any of you want to argue against that thesis. Jiahe, would you agree with what I said, or do you want to maybe argue against what I said? What do you think?
Well, I think you're really right when we look at what's going on in the next 1 decade or two, because Chinese economy is growing at a speed that is faster than economic regions like Europe or North America, where they have less population for each of them. They have much more income. That means their growth rate is really slowing down. But when you talk about 5 decades later, maybe India will also pick up, because India is having a similar population compared with China. It's about to be more than the China. Talk about the population. So if you look into the long picture, then maybe India will be also be able to contribute to the global consumption. But currently, if you look at the Indian GDP, is that its per capita GDP is only I think it's about $3,000 per capita. So that's about 1/4 of the Chinese level. So if you talk about in the next 1 or 2 decades, then China is going to probably take up the largest consumption market in the world.
Bruno, David, any rebuttals, or would you agree with?
No, I think it's going to take a while. I think arguably you could say the makeup of the GDP of China has to change for that to happen. As we were discussing earlier, this makeup has been mostly driven by investment, infrastructure, real estate in particular, and exports. And consumption is still, I think, even today, I think 39% of GDP. And in developed market, Europe or the US, I think it's more like 60%. So I think the contribution of consumption into the China GDP has to change for that to happen. Because of course we don't want this, the challenge that you put to us to be the results of everybody else declining except China. I think that would not be good for the rest of the world. And so we should assume that the other economy will also grow. And so therefore, the consumption has to grow faster in China for your challenge to be true. I do believe it's going to be true, but I think it's going to take a while, as I said, because the makeup of the GDP has to change.
Yeah. I mean, China's...
I have a couple
David,
of
go
points.
for it. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a couple of points to make there. One is that there's a big difference between consumption growth that's made possible because people are becoming wealthier, and consumption growth made possible because people are becoming able to borrow more. Unfortunately, in the United States, as we talked about before, wages have been pretty much stagnant, but consumption's been going up. And how is that possible? It's because we've had very, very loose monetary policy since essentially 1995. And that's leading to the current imbalances we have and the inflation we have. I think that will stop, and we're going to see interest rates go up a lot, and consumption's going to go down because people won't be able to borrow as much. And people are in financial pressure because they borrowed so much in the past. So I think that's what's happening in the United States. I'm less familiar with Europe, but I suspect sort of the same thing's been happening in Europe. China's growth so far has been because of income growth. Consumption growth has been driven by income growth. I think it's important that that continues. As Bruno was saying, China is in a transition point, and China's growth over the last 40 plus years has been driven by a series of, sort of just on time, smart reforms. And it's important that those reforms continue. But during the early stages of the transition, China was picking very low hanging fruit. It was easy to see what the reforms needed to be. Now it's a bit harder to figure out what they need to be. Maybe improvements in lifestyle are more important than GDP growth. Another point is that we're seeing consumption growth in a lot of poor places. You know, it may be a small number of dollars, but it's a big increase in income for them. So for instance, in Africa, we're seeing a lot of increase in consumption, but it's very cheap stuff. Nobody's buying, I mean, the rich people might be buying the latest iPhone, but the others are buying the cheapest phone they can get that does the job for them. And so we're seeing a lot of consumption as India, as was mentioned, but also in Africa. And I think Chinese business is in a better position to sell to those markets than many of the Western producers are, because they know how to sell to relatively poorer markets. And you may be seeing that out in the countryside in China. There may be, they're buying stuff that people that make $50,000, $100,000 a year don't really target. But if you're making less, you still want to consume, but you want to consume more smartly and a different kind of consumption basket.
Yeah. Well, David, you had the final word there. We are all out of time. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. David Blair, Senior Economist and Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, Chen Jiahe, CIO at Novum Arcade Technologies, and Bruno Lana, Senior Partner at Bain & Company. Thank you all so much for joining us on this edition of Econ Talk Kickstart 2023. Well, final consumption. Thank you. Well, final consumption here in China makes up over half of GDP right now. And as we've been discussing, there's still a lot of room for growth compared to more developed economies. For example, consumption makes up about 70% of the U.S. economy. And that highlights, I feel, the ways to go when it comes to growth of consumption here in China. And with China aiming to become a mid-level developed economy by the year 2035 with a per capita GDP of over $20,000 US and aiming to double its middle income population to over 800 million people by that time, I feel the China market is definitely still a growth market that businesses around the world simply cannot miss out on. And that will do it for this edition of Econ Talk Kickstart 2023. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time.